Hi, and welcome to the Improvisors podcast. I'm Kevin James, and this is my co-host, Neil Thomas.
Thanks, Kevin. In this series, we talk with improvisers about their history, their performance practices, and their aspirations.
And today we have the great pleasure of chatting with Peter Fraser and Dale Gorfinkel of the duet Sounds Like Movement. They speak about the difference between working with sound and movement improvisation, costume as instrument, and the marriage of different disciplines.
And the unexpected joys of working with unstable musical instruments.
Great.
Good morning, Peter Fraser and Dale Gorfinkel. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to be in conversation with Kevin James and myself on the Improvisors podcast. How are you both this morning?
Good, thanks.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Dale and Peter, it's wonderful to have you with us this morning. We're really looking forward to this interview.
Just dig in and start straight up. I'll ask you, Peter, because you're at the bottom of my left screen. How was it that you came to improvisation all those years ago?
It was either through Alwanda or Deborah Hay. I went to a Deborah Hay workshop at Fitzroy Town Hall, I don't know how many years ago, more than 30. Kevin was there. And I was just astonished. She started with a room full of people, like, I don't know how many people, more than 50, heaps. And some music playing. And a lot of them were people who'd never improvised or performed at all. And she had them improvising from the start, right from the start. It was just unbelievable. And I became fascinated by her process. And Alwanda would be the other one. I don't know which one came first, working with Alwanda. And his way of encouraging people to improvise by having a positive feedback thing, which was definitely not about just saying nice things. It was about learning what you enjoyed watching or doing. It was a really wonderful process. Oh, and he also offered little scores. So that was helpful to people to have little physical scores of, moving two parts of the body or something like that. Right. So that would have been the start.
Great. And Dale?
Yeah, I suppose in a music sense of improvisation, I started playing jazz when I was about 13. And that was initially on some wind instruments, trumpet mainly. And then probably the following year or about the same time, I started playing vibraphone. And then just learning a lot about jazz and listening to a lot of jazz and learning from CDs and pirating cassettes and whatnot, making bootlegs. And then I went to university playing jazz as well and getting a secondary education at the same time through the improvised music scene in Sydney, which was a very active community. And in fact, Peter and I met through some of those artists as well, people like Jim Denley and Amanda Stewart. But there was a very vibrant experimental music scene in Sydney at that time, as there still is. And so I got into also expanding the ways that I was playing the vibraphone, and that took me into a path of instrument building and installation making, and thinking about different contexts for music making and performance.
Great.
When did Sounds Like Movement commence? When did you get together and start to work?
I think you've got a better sense of those dates than me, Dale.
Okay, yeah, well, I think possibly we first met when Peter was in Sydney working with Tester Quincey on a project that some of my friends, including Jim Denley and Amanda Stewart, were working on. And as part of that project, they invited a number of other dancers and musicians to get involved. Yeah, I think we met around then, probably 2007 or so. It could have been, we could have first met earlier, but we probably started working together with Tess around that time. And then I moved to Melbourne from Sydney in 2008. And I think we probably did our first duo performance in 2009. And then we worked on a project as well with Tess in 2009 in performance space in Sydney, Carriage Works at least. And then we had a residency in Castlemaine with Punctum in 2010, which was a huge development period, I think. Even it was like maybe 1 week only, but it was very intense development time. And then, yeah, we've had a bunch of performances since then.
One of the things that you had mentioned in preparation for this was that you might like to use this opportunity to chat about the differences between improvisation as a movement-based artist, Peter, and as a sound-based artist, Dale. So that's one of the things we'd like to invite you to consider together this morning.
I'm really interested in that. I know where I come from in physical improvisation, in dance improvisation, which is basically from reading what's happening in the body and trying to notice that more and make some responses to what I notice. It's a very similar, I was just looking at some things Ros Crisp had written the other night. It's a very similar attitude to Ros Crisp, really, to noticing what's happening in the body, but you make decisions about it. So it's not just an automatic flow of something, it's a sort of a active attention. So that's where I look for material and make choices. And I'm not a musician by profession, and so I'm interested in where, for Dale, for instance, choices come, or inspiration comes, or the motivation comes for what you do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite varied. When I'm thinking about sounds like movement, it becomes a particular context for improvisation, and it's quite different to the other things that I'm involved in. So I think improvisation for me is like figuring out what's unique about a context, and that might involve the site that we're performing on, or even if it's not performing, if it's just for myself or with friends, how that place affects us, if it's indoors, if it's outdoors, if there's other materials at hand that we might like to use. Improvisation's also figuring out who you're working with and what's unique about those personalities together, and developing a language that is unique to that. So I often use the phrase like non-dogmatic improvisation. There's probably things that I'm dogmatic about, but when it comes to, I mean, there definitely are things I'm dogmatic about, but when it comes to a collective approach or a particular performance, it's trying to figure out what's unique about that, and that obviously changes from day to day and moment to moment and performance to performance. But there's a number of things I think in sounds like movement that we're playing with, and plays a big part of it. So even though it was initially a musician meeting a dancer, it's become a whole creative exploration for both of us that involves costume making, costumes that make sounds. It involves not only our own attention to those things, but also bringing the audience's attention to those things. instrument building, which is a big part of my practice, and then me building things for Peter to play as well, or for Peter to wear. And the focus might be on the phenomena of sound itself, like the physicality of sound, and not just about how some normal connotations of music, but how does sound get dispersed through a space, or what are the different ways of listening to sound that might be different from listening to a couple of speakers in headphones or a stereophonic recording. So public presentation, or doing that in the world outside of recording, there's a whole lot of other possibilities that are unique to that context that you can't get in a recording. So the physicality of it, the gesture of it, are things that we're playing with as well. They're all tools at our disposal.
Mm. Mm. See, for me, it was very interesting for us to throw ourselves together and in this group called Sounds Like Movement, where it was about how the movement of materials and bodies can result in sound, or what you might call dance, or what you might call music, or what you might call installation. And we were in the middle of it, and we also have a sort of a friendship that underpins a sort of a slightly clowning approach to the material. And that was initially developed when we did that residency. We developed these big cone head things out of paper, and costumes that made noise and would be torn apart as we worked. And Dale works often with equipment that it might disintegrate. It might be a vibraphone with bits of plastic cups that are making a noise, and they disintegrate as they strike whatever it is that's helping to make the noise. So you have actually objects that are improvising. I find that really exciting. But it's as if I've been thrown into the middle of this thing, and I'm only discovering the richness of it as it goes along. And is it okay if I give an example of just following that up? There's a thing that we do, which is, we call it long poles, which is playing the drums with what are actually flexible fiberglass poles for catching tuna. And so the poles are God knows how many meters long.
Is it squid, actually? Is it squid?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, they're squid poles. Yeah. And they're many meters long, like
7 or 10, right?
Yeah, but yes, I think they are the measures. And so we attach drumsticks to the end of these poles, and they become very long, floppy drumsticks. And then we have an assemblage of bits of drums, kids' drums, adult drums, garbage can lids, electric guitars in a big sort of looks like a bonfire. And we play them from a distance. And it's only after doing it a number of times that I've really understood it differently, because we're trying to think, are we doing a clowning thing? Are we trying to be funny? Are we playing with the interesting movements of the sticks? Am I trying to really do it well and have a pattern, or is that going to spoil it, or whatever? And it's only by now that I'm finding that what's exciting about it is that it's really fun to try and really play this stack of things with these poles and have the instrument work against you, So you're playing with a tool to play drums, which is actually working against you, successfully manipulating it. And the result is just a really interesting, both theatrically but also musically, a really interesting result from really striving to do it well. I don't know where that came from, but that's important to me anyway, uncovering more of the musicality of the group, I suppose. Yeah.
I think that's a part of how Peter's just described, this unpredictability with performing. That's definitely been a part of my practice in terms of making instruments, that you don't have full control over them. And when you don't have full control over them, you're actually forced to improvise. So it's kind of like I'm designing instruments which I can't control. So it keeps me on my toes and keeps me present in a performance as well. Something might suddenly stop working, or it might disintegrate, and then you have to do something, or it might keep playing itself, and then you don't have to make a choice in that moment until it stops doing its thing. And then you didn't have to make that choice either. It stopped by itself. So I think the long poles piece is definitely one of those things. And I think we had a number of pieces where there's a layer of unpredictability, that we're kind of juggling these things that could at any moment stop working or do a different thing.
And something that I guess all musicians already know, but that your task is also to nurture it with your ears. That seems to be, like if I'm working with the body, I nurture what I'm doing by feeling it through my body and by paying attention. And as a musical or sound making performer, my job is to nurture it with my ears and to sharpen my attention.
Yeah, I had a question around that area, and my experience has been that the visual domain is often the dominant domain as experiencing beings. People, for instance, they love to be able to see the. I think in part the success of the guitar is that it's very visual. And people have made a great effort to kind of combine their body with the guitar, and people feel when they're watching it that they're almost playing it. And there's also with vocalists, there's a kind of a connection with the voice, with the person's singing. And I don't think it's an accident that keyboardists tend to be a little bit at the back, or even the percussionists tend to be sort of at the back. I don't know why I'm going on about that, but yes, I think the question was around the difference between the visual worlds of performing or theatre and the sound worlds and the sensibilities around creating those. Maybe that's a topic you'd be interested in chatting about.
I'm immediately interested in one thing about that, is that we have often worked with paper costumes, which brings both into play. It's you can actually see where the sound's coming from, and when you're performing within a paper costume, your job is to move in a way that is sensitive to making sound. And so it's visually fascinating, but the visual doesn't dominate, and it helps you to hear, I think.
Yeah.
I suppose I would add to that, with a lot of music makers, I would say that they don't think about the visual. Maybe in a pop context, there's a lot of thought about the visual, and you get extra lights, and it's usually the same kind of red and blue and a bit of green light or something. It's a very standardized form of showbiz. But a lot of musicians, I think, will not think about how they're performing, and something like Sounds Like Movement has been a great vehicle to actually think about how the gesture and the non-sonic things shape an experience. And so, because when you go to a performance, as you say, you don't just hear the music, you see the person's body interacting with their instruments, or you see the instruments themselves and they have an effect on you, or there's a spark of curiosity that comes from all these non-sonic things. So I think what Peter and I have been offering is kind of quite a generous thing to the audience, in that there's lots of things that they can hold on to. So even though they might be experiencing a performance that is very experimental in terms of its approach to sound, and it might not sound like any other musical thing they've been to, or it might not look like any dance performance they've been to, or it might not look like any clown performance or theatre performance. There's all of those elements in there that can draw in attention to any one of the other elements. But for us, with the name Sounds Like Movement, the focus is about sound and movement mainly. And I think even in sound, there is already movement. You know, sound is vibration. So on a micro level, you have both together. And that kind of just gets expanded in terms of, okay, a string is vibrating. If you look closely enough, you'll see it vibrating. If you have a ping pong ball bouncing on a vibraphone bar that's playing itself, which is one of the instruments I make, it's heightening that motion of the vibration. You kind of see the power in the physicality of the object. So I think we're trying to find ways of putting all those things together, sometimes in ways that work and sometimes ways that don't work.
Mm.
Mm.
In recent times, and I can't comment on earlier times, but in recent times, the differentiation between a dancer and musician with each of you, it seems to be becoming less and less. It seems like you were both assuming roles that are combining both, or even more than both. So it's been interesting to watch Sounds Like Movement become what it has become. And it's as though you're each growing into each other's domains somewhat, and being formed by each other's work, to the point where it's hard to differentiate between mover and sound artist. So you both appear to be immersed in both.
Yeah, and trying to do that more, like with a very literal crossover, you know, of I'm trying to learn to play drums more, and Dale's trying to learn to play drums as a dancer, you know, trying to dance more. So it's quite literally in terms of those two areas, but yes, and the whole project is doesn't have boundaries like that between them.
I think one of the last gigs we did, Peter was playing the modified trumpet that I gave him. But I mean, the beautiful thing about it is it's an instrument that doesn't require any practice or virtuosity, really. That's not really what we're bringing to it. So it just requires someone blowing through it and pressing a button, and it's going to do something. And trying to create something more than the sum of its parts, I suppose, like that.
Mm. Mm.
Mm.
I had a question around, which is a really naive question. Often they're the ones that are overlooked, but what in the performance context, there's the two of you creating a performance for an audience engagement. Why improvisation?
That's interesting. I was actually thinking about that before this interview. That what I was thinking was that for me, it's not that everything is about improvisation. And I was listening to the interview you did with Andrew Morrish, who was very explicit that he was about improvisation, and he was interested not so much in, I'm probably putting this out of context, but not so much in himself as an improviser, but in the art of improvisation. He wanted to perform the art of improvisation, and he figured that would probably involve longer performances in order to have that accepted socially as a mode, but also that it would necessarily be lumpy and messy, you know, that improvisation isn't something that you can master, you know, and put it away and repeat it. But I was thinking that for me, I think all performance that's worth anything is improvised. Like all performance because even if you're performing in a play, if you were to enact it the same way every night, everyone would just be completely bored and you would be bored and it wouldn't work. So every night the performance has to be engaged with according to the conditions of you and the audience and the place and whatever, in order for it to live. So for me, improvisation is where I experience a sense of presence, of life going on. And I think that can happen in unimprovised performance, so to speak, too. So in improvisation, it's exciting because you're actually throwing to yourself the conditions where you have to live. You have to make something out of what's happened. So in body weather, which is a discipline that I've mainly been trained in, perhaps, one part of the training is often to have your body moved by someone else, so that you get used to not making your own choices about what's happening to your body even, so that you can get used to not having to consciously engineer everything from inside out. So I think you can have that sense of discovery, whether that's through explicitly improvisation or through taking a, what's the word, an attentive exploratory approach to everything you do.
Yeah. You used the word before, virtuosity. I think not suggesting there was something to aspire to, but I was thinking in some ways the way you create instruments, Dale, and the way Peter and you work with instruments, that almost works against virtuosity, because they're instruments that in some ways are as much controlling you as you might be attempting to work with them. And hence the availability you're talking about, Peter, to moment by moment, is of seemingly absolute necessity when you're working with instruments that are not within your control. It seems like you're setting up a situation where availability to what is happening and responsiveness is really quite inherent. Would you be willing to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's everything you said is true. I just thought of a couple of instruments perhaps that explain the point. I think could have been the last performance we did for your event, Kevin, at Dance House. The instrument was, I suppose, as a costume, we call it the paper cloud. It's basically a bigger than human sized paper bag that is sculpted around us, and we climb into it. And in this performance, we had two of them. So we were inside each of these bags and can't see out. And any slight movement that we make is actually quite loud inside, just the sound of the crinkling bag. And probably to the audience, it's tuning them in, you know, they have to pay very close attention. And our task, the piece that we came up with, was just to try and listen to the room and to each other and try and find each other. So without having any visual context, we're just using our ears to try and find each other. And then I think the piece just ended in us, these two bags hugging each other. Yeah, I think the instruments do, I can't remember the exact question, but the instruments do help to dictate what the performance is going to be. And then maybe another thing to add, in that context, it requires a lot of flexibility on our parts to figure out what our framework for the improvisation is going to be. And in that context, we only figured that out like a minute before the performance started, which is, I think, another layer of improvisation. It's not that we figured it out and that was going to be it. There was still a lot of room for improvisation within the piece, but we had to be on our toes to be willing to make changes in the minute just before. So maybe that's a different kind of improvisation. But then Yeah, Peter, are there any other instruments that you think of in this context?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about one of them. Because you mentioned something the other night about free jazz and how you listen partly through that framework as well. This was an instrument that Dale developed where he looks like some sort of ant because he's wearing a crash helmet, and on the crash helmet wires come out perhaps up to 1 meter long with drumsticks on the end. So there's a number of these and coming out the helmet. So it looks like some sort of fashion conscious alien or ant. And Dale was playing this for the first time surrounded by instruments in like a sort of a 360-degree sphere around him. And those instruments, again, were things which could make a noise if you hit them, like things that are meant to make a noise, like cymbals and drums or bits of metal or electric guitars. And so Dale was doing something incredibly physical, actually, moving around, playing these things. And it was very daggy and witty and humorous to watch and sculpturally interesting. But it was honestly some of the most exciting music I've ever heard. It was, for Dale, it was a tryout, and for me, that was my genuine response. Was just so exciting. So I suppose it's an open question, Dale, if you can respond to that description in some way. And you'd mentioned something about how it does relate to other sorts of music for you. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it does for a lot of the things that we do in our duo. It's similar. That instrument that you described is kind of similar, I think, to the long poles instrument you described before, where the two of us are standing playing. Initially, I think we were playing a kid's drumstick, a kid's drum kit, like a tiny drum kit, but with really long poles. But it's kind of ridiculous, clowny type setup. But the sound of both of these setups, for me, sounds like fantastic free jazz drumming. So this kind of play between the ridiculous and the serious, I think is kind of a core for what we do together, but also in a number of contexts for us. Like we both play in a group called Prophets as well. We're all wearing these masks that we've made out of DIY materials. And it looks kind of carnivalesque or a bit ridiculous, but for me, the strength is, the foundation of it is the sound. Like for most of us in the group, it's still really a serious ensemble that we feel like we're making a contribution to the, some part of a contribution to the canon of music, And I think that the drumming is like that for me. Like it's, even though, it looks ridiculous, for me, it's probably one of the most earnest musical expressions I've made. And there still can be an element of play with it. Like I think in my first performance, I'm aware that it's theatrical, and I might suddenly stand up and do something unexpected or just fix the guitar, and I'm aware of the little chortles in the audience and people not quite being sure how to react. But I'm thinking of also my favorite drummers or my favorite music I've ever heard, and it might sound like Tony Oxley, or it might sound like Milford Graves, or a number of drummers who I love, but be perceived in a completely different way. And maybe the theatrics might be a pathway in for some people, but it doesn't take away from some core spiritual or some other expression that I'd really love to be able to express.
And I think that the theatrical thing and the clownish aspect of it is really beautiful, because it's allowed to be there, but not foregrounded or self-conscious, not self-conscious. It's just allowed to be part of it. It is part of it. And I'd sort of like to, if I could just cut back to the thing we were saying before about improvisation, that sometimes what we do in Sounds Like Movement is explicitly not improvised too, like in terms of totally free-form improvisation, but it's a relation to the site. So we had a residency at Merlston where we were in an old building and had time to develop a performance with a number of sections in relation to that site. So that improvisation was, as improvisation often is, was used in terms of finding how to work with the materials there. And there were, for instance, a couple of big white tables on rollers where the table can flip up to be a flat surface, and where it made the most exquisite sound as it rolled on the wooden floor. And so we had these cone head things, and we draped white material over ourselves and over the table so that they became like big, wide, white dervish costumes. And we could simply spin, which the tables are designed to do on the spot. So to my mind, that was a very beautiful, interesting, engaging and musical performance, which came from experiments, but wasn't explicitly improvisation. Yeah.
I was just coming back to referencing the drumming thing. I think I've struggled to express certain things that I feel like I'd like to express or are important to me. And I think one of the reasons why I've gone into experimental pathway in terms of instrument building, finding new context for things, is perhaps like coming from a jazz background. At some point, I realized, the music that I was making was not my music. There's a level of learning African American music from the other side of the world 40 years after it's been made and creating identities in that. And I suppose a lot of people still do that. But through the conversations I was having with my fellow artists, it's like, this didn't seem relevant. So we're looking for new languages that feel more personal, or, people use the word authentic. And so there's like a challenge to find ways of expressing things that you feel like are important to express. And then for me, like the headbanging drumming setup, it's like, oh, now I think I've found a vehicle that I can express something that is still unique to me, but allows me to kind of also reference perhaps things that have influenced me hugely, have changed my life in some ways. So that, touching on that cultural thing, it is great because you kind of also get to these points of what are the barriers of your cultural experience. For example, if you want to improvise with musicians from Morocco who practice Sufism, then that can change your understanding of music, or how you perceive sound, or how you perceive time, and it can, you kind of get to these points of opening. And I think for Peter and I, there's a number of things that have happened in this duo that have opened us both to different creative practices as well. If it's me being more interested in dance, Peter being more interested in music or costume making or performance making, or we've done some video stuff together as well. And then that influences also the other things that we're involved in. So I think there's some things through our Sounds Like Movement duo that have filtered into our Prophets collaborations as well, where that group now embraces things beyond the musical and the mask making as well, with dance and video, and kind of exploring other theatrical approaches to music making.
Great.
I have another simple question. What is it you intend for audiences to experience? Is that a reasonable question?
I've got some answers to that. Well, two in a way. I'm hoping that they will find it fascinating and enjoyable and unique and witty and orally and visually enticing, and also that people will sharpen their attention in all dimensions, whether that's to movement or to sound. So that's just off the top of my head. That's.
I think we had some pieces, like we had this one thing we did a bit called the paper game, which kind of became a part of a number of our performances, where we'd start handing out like an A4 size piece of paper to the audience, and the challenge would be for them to pass it to each other without making a sound. And the instructions were given verbally like that, or we'd just do that through miming or motion, or disappointment, like if they made a sound, we'd take it away from them and then start again. And then the piece, we'd eventually hand out bigger and bigger pieces of paper until it was like it involved 3 or 4 people having to pass the piece of paper across the room and carry it together. And that piece of paper then became one of the costumes that we climbed into, as like the paper cloud that we described before. So I think that activity makes it clear that there's an invitation to attune the ears, and that the performance is about listening as much as anything. Because I think if you do something in a theatre context where people expect the show, they might miss out on some of those on a focus like that. So I think the audience can get a number of things out of it. I think there's that generosity. Like some of the shows that we've put on, I think that they've been filled with a lot of these pieces, and we've often talked about our duo as being of acting a bit like a band, where you develop a set, like a repertoire of pieces, and you can put them together in any way you like for each gig, and that order can change, or you can make new pieces, but we can also come back to old pieces. But I think some of the more recent and maybe more enjoyable gigs is where we've just done one thing or 2 things rather than 10 things. And the focus for us is like exploring as much as possible within that one piece. So like spending 15 minutes doing one piece, and then that's the end of the gig, is an achievable challenge that also I think is enjoyable for the audience.
Right. Yeah, just in relation to the issue that we raised about improvisation and performing to audience and sounds. I was just interested in that because I'd been thinking about relationship to audience through my solo practice, because we recently had a thing that one of the Now pieces was focused on that. What was the relationship to audience? And I couldn't for the life of me think what mine was. And just 2 interesting things to feed back. I think that during the performance at Dance House, there was a moment when I suddenly noticed that you could hear a pin drop, and it was that sort of sense you can sometimes have that the audience is totally engaged, and it's this mysterious thing. How do I know the audience is totally engaged? And I think it's partly complete silence. It's very exciting or very surprising and astonishing to experience that happening. And it made me think 2 things: that was an important thing to rediscover and notice, but that it would also be completely wrong to aim for it from my point of view. If you set out to try and do that, if you were a certain kind of more manipulative performer, is what it feels like, you could set out to do that, but it doesn't seem like that should be the aim. And so my conclusion was that what was important in improvised performance for me was paying absolute attention to what was emerging or could be made to emerge or could be done something with, and that if you're totally engaged, then the audience, there's a good chance that the audience might be fascinated in the same way, by being encouraged to bring their attention to what's emerging.
Speaking of the end of the gig, I think we're getting close to the end of this gig. Time has gone so quickly. Feels like we could continue this this inquiry and for quite an extended time, but our time has gone. Neil and I have been, I think, both sitting here on the screen all the time, intrigued and nodding a lot, I think, and I hope that's hope that that's looked okay. But that is the end of the morning, really, the end of the interview. What a rich prospect it's been, and thank you so much for making yourself available, for choosing to sort of delve into details of what you do. So enriching to listen to.
And what a great collaboration that you've had, a rich and I would say very special collaboration. It's difficult collaborating, but to collaborate from such different places, to come from different places and come together is really a rich and original and unique, fascinating prospect.
Such a difficult person.
What was that?
That's right. I just said, and with such a difficult person.
Are you talking about yourself or Dale?
Yeah, that's right. It's been definitely an effortless collaboration, I would say.
Oh, lovely. All the best with Sound Likes Movement. Hope you get to explore it more and more people get to see it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Performance, or was he talking about improvisation, gave audiences an experience of beginner's mind.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, great.